Alrighty, well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. On the program today, we are rejoined by our returning champion, David Swanson. David is the executive director of World Beyond War. He's the host of Talk World Radio, which you can listen to on Pacifica Network. And if you go to David's YouTube channel, you can also get it there. And he's also a member of RootsAction.org. The author of brilliant books like Leaving World War II Behind, also When the World Outlawed War, and he's also the author of other books such as War No More, The Case for Abolitionism, War is Never Just, War is a Lie, and Killing is Not a Way of Life. And we're here to talk about, well, all sorts of things, but so let's get into it before time runs out. David, first off, thank you so much for coming back on the program.
Very glad to. Thanks for having me.
Always an honor to speak to you, David. And actually, David, before we talk about your two brilliant books, which I read over the summer in August, I have to talk to you about. We have to talk about the persecution of a comrade of yours. So, can you talk to our audience about the persecution of Ukrainian pacifists as well as World Beyond War member Yurii Sheilazhenko, and how is he faring? And I hope I didn't butcher his name.
Well, I don't know that I can say it correctly, but my best try is Youri Sheilazhenko. And Yurii is a board member of World Beyond War and has been since quite a while before Ukraine made it into the news around the world with the invasion by Russia, but Yurii is based in Kyiv, in capital of Ukraine, and he is, as you might expect, as a board member of World Beyond War, against every side of every war now, in the past, and in the future. And this, of course, during the height of war fever, which in Western culture really a year and a half ago for some weeks, and ever since diminishing very slowly, was the highest war fever I've ever seen, if you could put a thermometer on such things. During these periods, it becomes almost incomprehensible to most people that someone could oppose both sides of a war. What could that possibly mean? And those people include the Ukrainian government. So the Ukrainian government is literally prosecuting Yurii for the crime of defending the Russian invasion and using as evidence a statement in which Yurii repeatedly and explicitly denounces the Russian invasion. And this only becomes comprehensible when you understand that in denouncing Ukrainian war making as well, they consider that simply to be the equivalent of supporting Russian war making. There's no ability to grasp that one could oppose both sides of a war. I mean, this has been true forever. Every time I've opposed both sides of a war, I've been accused of supporting whichever side somebody opposes. And so this is what Yurii is facing. He's under a sort of arrest now. He can't leave his home at night. He's monitored, and he has to show up at all kinds of hearings, and eventually they are going to try to convict him and put him in prison for speaking for peace in this great bastion of democracy that's fighting for all of our rights. So one reason to support him is because he's a wonderful guy. Another reason is to inform the world that the government of Ukraine does these things, and, oh, by the way, has no elections, has no opposition political parties, has no freedom of speech. Like this is your model of democracy that you're trying, absurdly in any case, to persuade people of by killing them in large numbers, and bragging about the body counts, by the way, even though it's a purely defensive operation. So, this is what happens if you speak for peace in the wrong place.
Unbelievable. And can you talk to our audience about how he's how he's faring with with this persecution that the Zelensky government is inflicting on him, and I'm sure others as well.
Well, I haven't been there. I had the opportunity to go there some weeks back, and people will, chip in contributions to send you there. But I just can't take several days of traveling and several days of traveling back to be at a court hearing for 5 minutes in Kiev. I wish I could, because I'd love to see Yurii in person. But our other board member, John Rohr, and various other people with World Beyond War and other groups from around the world did go there and took the petition that we had to the court, asking them to drop the prosecution of Yurii. And by his report, they were overwhelmed and amazed and shocked by such support. And having international observers there and having this petition with thousands of signatures. So, go to worldbeyondwar.org, and no matter how cynical you've grown and how entrenched your false belief that petitions never work may be, realize that a global petition, even small as we may be in our own towns, globally, there are a lot of us who haven't gone nuts, who don't support mass murder, and it impresses people in a place like Kiev. So sign the petition and share it. I haven't spoken with Yurii in some days. I haven't delved into his personal state deeply anyway, but last I spoke with him about it, he was in very high spirits, very cheerful, doing just exactly as fine as ever. And I think he's long since come to terms with the fact of what he's doing and what he's up against, and he's at peace with it.
Unbelievable. Well, I hope all will be well, and I hope enough people are signing this petition and doing other forms of direct action to get him get him free, as well as other voices of peace who are being silenced by the Zelensky by the Zelensky government. And I'm sure the same thing is happening in Russia. I then have to ask this follow-up question, which is, any sight of this war ending? Because it's hilarious how sometimes you read sometimes you read corporate media outlets, sometimes just the headline, and they'll say that Russia is losing the war and that millions of its soldiers are deserting the war, and then you'll sometimes read other news outlets which are more left leaning and tend to be anti-imperialist, although they and they'll report that it's Ukraine that's losing the war and stuff like that. So I'm curious, with your grassroots investigation, any sight of this war ending, or
there you go.
Can you hear me, David? What's happening? David, can you hear? What the? Can you see me now?
Are you back?
Yeah, I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. There seems to be. Oh wow, there seems to be.
I'm sorry, I didn't touch anything, but you were frozen and silent.
Okay, sorry about that. Yes, my internet seems to be okay. Anyways, all right, so we are back. Sorry about that, folks. Internet connection problems. So anywho, so as I was saying, David, so it seems so if you read, corporate media news outlets and their headlines, it seems as if Russia is losing this war in Ukraine, and all Ukraine needs is simply more weapons in order to win this war. And then if you read left-leaning news outlets, anti-imperialist websites, it's they say that actually it's Ukraine which is losing the war. So I'm curious. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Well, I think people need to acquire the difficult skills of proper news reading. Most of what you find in any media outlet that is favoring one side of a war is fluff and nonsense and biased slanting of language. You have to learn how to spot the actual verifiable facts within, which make up a tiny percentage of the reporting. Yes, it helps to look at the Russia's about to win tomorrow people and the Ukraine's about to win tomorrow people, both, but also to look at more independent, more verifiable reporting by people who aren't doing that cheerleading, and especially to look at the statements that are coming out with less than official approval from people within the militaries of both sides, because for many, many months now, both sides have officially been proclaiming we're about to win any second, but people within both militaries, low and high ranking, up to the very top of the US military, have been quietly, accidentally blurting out or leaking the obvious fact that it isn't true, that it's an endless stalemate. A week or so ago, the New York Times led off with a big graphic showing the microscopic gains made by each side since January 1st. Here's the front line. It's not enough ground to bury the bodies in that they're killing to gain this ground. That's how small it is. And even the big corporate media is slowly starting to admit it, right? You read the Washington Post today as we're speaking. David Ignatius, who effectively works for the CIA, it's muddled. It makes no sense. He says both it's hopeless and pointless and endless quagmire, and there's nothing we can do but press on to victory. He says both of those things, but the first one didn't used to be in there at all. They're starting to say out loud how endless and pointless and hopeless a quagmire it is, in part because even within the US Congress, they're threatening to cut off the money. And everyone has always understood quite openly, the Ukrainian government and neighboring governments, if they cut off the money, Ukraine will have to be willing to negotiate peace. And Ukraine has been unwilling to negotiate peace because the US government has said, here is endless free weaponry as long as you'll refuse to negotiate peace. And so, this is important for some growing fraction of Western population to understand that peace, that a better deal than anybody will ever get now could have been had prior to the invasion with Russia's proposal of December 2021, for example, and that a better proposal than anyone will ever have anymore could have been had in the early days after the invasion, when they had almost come to an agreement and Boris Johnson was sent over to put the kibosh on it. So, it's difficult. It's always harder and harder the more months you've lived through the demonization of the enemy, the demonization of compromise, the internalization of the idea that compromise is treason and compromise is heresy. My wife teaches, toddlers, preschool. Can you imagine if we taught our little kids that compromise is evil and you should never speak with your friends, you should always hit them harder? What a world we would develop, But this is what we tell presidents and prime ministers, right? Because of war fever, because of war madness, and it's very hard to outgrow that. You think, but does that mean that Putin isn't Satan? That Putin is an angelic saint? Because these are the two choices, right? He can't be something in between. It's very hard for people, and yet, if you can put it in a different context, it's incredibly stupid.
Yeah, what you just said. It kind of reminds me, when you read, well, not when you, yeah, when you're exposed sometimes to far right, tabloid media and the kind of bullying that goes into invading other people's privacies, exposing people at who might be cheating on someone and so forth, and you're exposing it for all the world to see and for everybody to like poke their fingers and mock the people. And I think to I think to myself, geez, when we're when I was growing up, the teachers at school taught us, don't bully other people, don't gossip about other people and whatnot. And I just think to myself, how do you go from teaching, little kids and teenagers and even young adults that to when you're the head of when you're head of the business, you have to be ruthless and you have to fire people and not feel any shame. And when you get a nice cushy job in corporate media, you get to invade other people's privacies, gossip about them, air their dirty laundry out, and hey, if they have a nervous breakdown, not our fault. I mean, so that's. And that's what I'm thinking of when we think of how much we've just normalized the unthinkable, which is war, the ultimate, unthinkable. I'm curious your response on that.
I mean, this is what you've just said is basically my response every time I get asked in almost every interview I've ever done. How did you become a peace activist? Why did you decide to be for peace? As if it's this just crazy, like, why did you decide to play the electric guitar in a jazz band? Like it's some particular choice I made. And my response is always, why the hell didn't you? What else can one possibly do? It's the worst thing one's ever seen. And it occurs to me, and I relate usually, that we teach this to every little kid in every country on earth. We tell them to talk, not fight. I mean, every little kid is told this. And if you grow up in a society, as many of us do, and myself in particular, growing up in the Washington, D.C. area in the heart of the empire, and all your friends' parents and the whole society is, clearly investing vast treasure in working on the enterprise of mass murder, if you're a little kid who doesn't take any crap, who wants the adults to walk the walk and doesn't, gets dragged to church and then says, well, prove it to me. If you're that kind of little kid, then you have to figure out how do you, either there's a conflict between be a nice person and the enterprise of war, or they somehow fit together. And I think most people just shove it into the back of their head and live with it. But if you don't, well, then you have to oppose war. It's the thing most in conflict with our basic human values, and we shouldn't learn to live with that.
I completely agree with you, and I think actually that's a perfect segue. And that's a perfect segue to your book, Leaving World War II Behind, which I got the chance to read, along with When the World Outlawed War over the summer. And it's both books are brilliant. I can't recommend them enough, especially because World War II is often marketed as the good war. Ukraine is also marketed as the good, is also marketed as the good war. Putin is Putin is the Hitler that we have to confront. But before we talk a little bit about that, I have to ask this question, which is which is in your book. You discussed how the U.S. and its allies and particularly U.S. business supported Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, but I'm curious, how come you didn't discuss the Spanish Civil War and the U.S., Britain, Canada, and its allies de facto supporting the fascist side of that war as a prelude to World War II?
I guess because I was focused narrowly on World War II. It's not that it isn't an interesting topic. It falls in between these two books that you held up that are about the period after World War I and the period leading up to World War II. I think maybe I've never been as attracted as some people are to learning more about the Spanish Civil War because I don't glorify violence. And so many people do. So many people with whom I agree about economic policies and governmental policies and politics and culture in general believe that the proper thing to do was to go over there and help kill people on the right side, and that doesn't change the important fact that the absolute worst thing to do was to support the fascist side, and that's what Western governments, apart from the Soviet Union, did, was stay out of it or support the fascist side, and that led not only to horrific developments in the conduct of war, including aerial bombing of cities, but led to the rise of fascism in Europe. I mean, it's completely related, but at some point you have to stop adding stuff to a book, or the book never ends. So.
Well, then a quick follow. Then a quick follow up, because I had to ask this question. So the Spanish Civil War, even though. So is your issue with the Spanish Civil War when you hear, leftists and anti-imperialists talk about the Spanish Civil War? So is your issue when the Spanish Civil War is discussed is that people tend to glorify, the anti-fascist side, either the communist side, the anarchist side, the broad social democratic side, and ergo a lot of leftists then will say that the Spanish Civil War was a good war because it was in defense of a fascist takeover of Spain.
Well, we've had this conversation about various wars, you and I, and many people and I'm sure we will continue for many years.
And of course, sorry to interrupt. Some people would say that that's a just war, that that the Spanish government had to fight against a fascist takeover, and ergo it was a war of self-defense against a fascist takeover. So yes. But go ahead with your response. Sorry about that.
Given that no two things on earth are equal, you can always find a worse side of every war. And you can always apply with various degrees of accuracy a just cause to any war. Doesn't make the war just to apply a just cause to it. You could say, well, you must support the U.S. Civil War, northern side, or you love slavery, right? These are your two choices, even though most of the world ended slavery by wiser methods without killing 750,000 people and creating hostility and destruction and racism and segregation that have lasted to this day, right? I think the important thing is not to go back to the 1930s and say, people in Spain should have been as smart as people in India. It's to say we are now coming up on the 2030s, and we know a hell of a lot more. We have endless studies showing that unarmed civilian defense works better, is more likely to succeed, and those successes are likely to be far longer lasting. The reason that a country like Ukraine doesn't prepare and invest in and use unarmed civilian defense instead of military defense isn't because it doesn't work, isn't because there isn't vast evidence of it succeeding in many places and having potential to succeed vastly more and costing far less and doing less damage in the process, and the success almost certain to be far longer lasting. It's because the government of Ukraine doesn't want the population of Ukraine to know how to resist tyranny and abuse from the government of Ukraine. Is the same reason that the government of Russia doesn't want the entire population of Russia to know how to do nonviolent resistance and organized nonviolent actions, to non-cooperate, to block all streets, to to resist all orders, to shut down all infrastructure, to get what they want. If the United States government took 3% of what it spends on the US military and instead trained the entire population of the United States, the United States would not be occupiable. You can't occupy a place that refuses to be occupied. But we also wouldn't have student debt. It would be gone tomorrow, right? We wouldn't have the abuse of our work, of our retirement, of our environment, of our energy, of our transportation system. We would have a people that could demand what they want, and no government wants that, you know.
Interesting. And another thing, yeah, and when we talk about World War II and how it's cynically used to justify to justify more imperial wars, endless war, like with the R2P doctrine and so forth. I'm I'm also just curious, Israel's settler colonialism and its ongoing subjugation of the Palestinian people, the Arabic people. How come you didn't bring that as an example in your Leaving World War II behind, as Israel will often use its the Jewish people's past grievances with long centuries, pogroms and the Holocaust too. This is why we have to brutally subjugate the Palestinian people and have endless conflict with our neighboring countries.
I'm going to go and look after this. I'm pretty sure you're wrong, and that I did mention that in passing, although there's no chapter about it. There's no chapter about anything happening in this millennium, because it's a book about World War II. But in any case, you're of course perfectly right that one of the ways in which World War II facts and mythology are used and abused is through justifying the creation of Israel and the crimes of the Israeli government, because it somehow balances some moral scale and serves poetic justice, and a people, even though it isn't hardly any of the actual same people, can do whatever the hell it wants because of what was done to it in some other age, which is of course outrageous, immoral nonsense. I think I think while I'm trying to get people to, in a sense, forget World War II, meaning forget the lies and the misconceptions and the mythology of World War II, forget stuff like the bombs saved lives in Japan and so forth. One problem is the failure to remember the truth about World War II. And so you have this war fever where everyone has understood that anyone who hates Russians, anyone who does anything against Russia is a saint. And then you're accidentally cheering for Nazis in the Canadian Parliament, right? And so you have to go back and say, well, do you understand which side the Soviet Union was on in World War II? I mean, this is like basic facts. Who was on which side? Because you have this history. I have, by the way, tons of books, including books that are newer than those two. And my latest one is about the Monroe Doctrine and its expansion over 200 years to a global Monroe Doctrine. And it started with hostility toward Russia 200 years ago, this December. And that hostility toward Russia from the US government has lasted almost every moment of those 200 years. But there was this break during World War II when the Soviets were doing most of the killing and dying on the side that everyone in the United States was told was the good side. And the United States was refusing to join in, was refusing to open a second front against the Nazis. And people in the United States were putting bumper stickers on their cars celebrating the Soviets and demanding that the US open a second front to support the Soviets. And the minute World War II was over, not only did you have people in the British and US militaries, and I mean the guys at the top, and I mean Winston Churchill, demanding that the Nazi soldiers be redirected to fight the commies, but you had the entire culture in the United States make Russia the enemy. I mean, you can see this before the war ends if you go watch the Oppenheimer movie, right? They're telling these scientists, you're making this bomb to kill the Nazis. You're making this bomb to threaten the Nazis. We won't even have to use it. It's just to stop the Nazis. And the Nazis surrender and say, well, what are you doing? Keep making the bomb. What are you stopping for? Make the damn bomb. This is a bomb because our enemies are in Moscow, and of course, yes, sir, and they most of them obey orders. But it's important that people who think for themselves not forget things on command or remember things that didn't actually happen on command.
It is quite unbelievable in that, as you mentioned, Churchill supported, the fascist takeover of Greece, and we continue to support even Nazi collaborators who installed a military junta in Greece. As Nazi Gates has shown, Canada and its allies, welcome endless Nazi war criminals, and yet it is quite unbelievable. It is quite farcical, all of this. But then I have to. But then a quick follow up to that is what's your response? What's your response to people who would defend the anti-fascist side of the Spanish Civil War and said that the Spanish government had no choice but to respond militarily to to an attempt of an armed military takeover of their government. And we also hear a lot of people who I think Nazi people who are apologists for the Nazis, but I'm even sure people who aren't trying to apologize for the Nazi, but they'll say things like, well, Stepan Bandera or such and such a Estonian or whatever Eastern European country, they only fought with the Nazis because they had to fight the tyrannical Soviet imperialism, which dates back to even Russian Tsarism. So I'm curious, what would be your response to those arguments?
Well, I mean, once you accept that there's nothing better than war and that each war only has two sides, and the two sides may be horrifically evil, but one of them's a little more evil than the other, if not a lot more evil than the other, then you can forgive and excuse anything. You join the lesser evil side and you kill and you maim and you torture and you abuse and you destroy for that side, and you justify it because you've pre-justified whatever, because it's war, damn it, but if you ask somebody who's defending people who fought the Soviets during World War II, and it's okay that they were Nazis because they were fighting the Soviets, I would ask them to think about a more recent war. Think about the current war in Ukraine. Is it okay to fight on either side because both sides are evil there? Was it okay to fight on the Afghan side in Afghanistan or the Iraqi side in Iraq? They're going to scream, hell no, only one side, right? And yet there isn't a good side on any war, in any war. Everybody is fighting for a horribly flawed government, or perhaps no plan for any government yet at all. They just want to destroy something and then create something, and committing horrors in the process. World Beyond War just had our annual conference online, and we did a three-way debate where one person argued that Russia had no choice but to invade Ukraine. There was no other choice possible. They had to invade Ukraine. And another argued Russia invaded Ukraine with its military. Ukraine had no possible choice other than to militarily respond to Russia's invasion. And I argued they both had better choices. And very skewed audience, I think, although one of my fellow debaters refused to allow us to poll people and see what their opinions were before and after, which we like to do. But I think most of the people, unlike the general public in many countries, most of the people agreed with me going in, and they probably agreed with me going out. But neither one of my fellow debaters really tried to make a case at all against my case. They just wanted to talk about how evil the other side was. They debated each other, and I talked about something else, and they were both right. All the horrors that one of them attributed to Russia were true, and vice versa, or nearly so. Most of what they said was indisputably accurate, but neither one of them had the slightest argument for why you couldn't do something better than war. And regardless of who you want to blame more or most or entirely, which of course is dumb, for starting a war, the important thing is to end it, And of course, ending it in a negotiating room is going to be easier with a bit of honesty and humility. But regardless, the need is to end it. And you're not going to end it through destroying and overthrowing either Kiev or Moscow. And if you did, what would you have ended? There would be years of hell to come.
I have three. I have three final questions. I wasn't planning on asking this, but respond briefly to this to the person who says that nonviolence doesn't work, there's a very controversial Black nationalist, Khalid Mohammed, who who would like to when he was alive, he definitely wanted to overthrow, the apartheid government of the U.S., the anti-Black racist government of the U.S., and so forth. And when the person was, and when the person who was interviewing him, Louis Theroux, was trying to push back, saying that a race war would be an awful thing, you think the response to somebody like Amadou Diallo is more, is more killings, and the gentleman, Khalid Mohammed, he responded back saying, I'm saying we need to speak the language of the white man, that the white man only understands violence, and we have to speak to him in the language that he understands. So I'm curious, what would be your response to that? And how and what do you think is the first way that we in our lives try to build a world beyond war, where we don't talk about war crimes and that and stuff like that, but actually say that but actually say no, war should never be an option, and have it banned, as as a bunch of brilliant people in the peace movement waged back then with the Kellogg-Briand Pact.
Well, there are endless reports put out by think tanks funded by weapons companies that push the idea that there are only two things you can do: war or lying back and taking it, and who push the idea relentlessly that there are governments that are personified in an evil dictator who only understands violence and nothing else. I mean, this way of thinking, whether you thought it up on your own or you found it somewhere, Lockheed Martin loves it. And if you didn't think it independently, they'd pay you substantially to be willing to think it, and do. And it's in Hollywood movies, funded and created with editorial control by the U.S. military. I mean, you're not challenging anything thinking that stuff. That's what they want you to think. The notion that there's some alternative, that you can do something other than war, I mean, is so offensive to these people that that they give out the Nobel Peace Prize, as they did this morning, to anything other than advocacy for peace. Find me a good cause: educating girls, saving the climate, ending the death penalty, human rights in nations that the U.S. military wants to target. Anything other than peace. and it's okay. How do we move beyond that? How do we move to legally banning war? Well, I mean, one of the points made by that book is that we've already done it. And it would be easier, were we willing to go and recognize an existing law than it is to create a new one, because we now live in a world much worse than it was 100 years ago in terms of being able to create a new treaty banning all war. But we should at least recognize that for all the good and all the flaws in something like the United Nations, it didn't ban war. It legalized war. War had been banned, and the United Nations legalized it by creating loopholes for it, which include claims of defensiveness, which every side of every war has always claimed to be defensive, and claims of UN authorization of wars, so that people tend to imagine, even when they're not, that wars meet one of those two loopholes and are therefore acceptable and legal. And you have this notion that international bodies can somehow make the worst crime there is legal. Americans think NATO makes wars legal, for God's sake. And so I think we have to get back to a better way of thinking, and we have to get more active. But in terms of the technical nature, I mean, we don't really, a new draft of a better law won't save us when we've already got all the laws we need. We just need to create the public pressure to abide by them. And we don't need new ideas. A rules-based order is a great idea. We should have one. The United States should join one that is advanced right now principally by the global South, not by the United States.
Yes, and I think, but I wonder, do you think we'll be able to get to a place where a neo Kellogg, Kellogg-Briand pact can be waged? Do you think we can, get to a place where war is completely outlawed?
I think with the growing likelihood of nuclear apocalypse and the need for unimaginable supplies of luck to continue surviving as a species while nuclear weapons exist, we either ban war or we die. It's nonviolence or non-existence. And I don't have any powers of predicting the future. I can pretend to answer such questions, but I have no ability to do so. But I know that these are our choices, and I know which one I choose to try to work for.
And and sort of, my final question, is this, in your book, you talked about in your book, you talked about the eugenics movement and its influence on Nazism, and how Hitler was inspired and heavily influenced by the U.S.'s Manifest Destiny, its settler colonial project, its brutal theft, dispossession, and ongoing subjugation of Native Americans. And so I've asked you this question before, but I have to ask this again, which is, what do you think it's going to take for the anti-war movement, eco-justice movement, the workers' movement, the workers' rights movement, the Black left, the Latino left, the feminist, and the broad left and peace movement, to show more urgent solidarity to the plight of indigenous people? And I remember when I once interviewed you, and we talked about pushing back against the idea of a good war, and I mentioned Afghanistan, and I mentioned that Afghanistan was the U.S.'s longest war. You wonderfully corrected me, saying that actually no, the longest war the U.S. has ever been in is its ongoing brutal subjugation of Native Americans. So I have to ask that question, and I'm curious your response.
Well, that's very true. I think, including not just current oppression and deprivation of rights, but wars recognizable as wars, as major military conflicts by everybody's definition that were waged in particular parts of North America, of the continental United States for numerous decades. I mean, there's no question that the US government waged wars that were much longer than the war in Vietnam by any definition, or the war in Afghanistan by any definition. They just aren't counted as real wars because they aren't considered to have been wars against real nations or real people. And this is a sort of bigotry in historical understanding. I think it's important that we change some of these things. I think it's more important that we change behavior going forward as we're facing climate and nuclear apocalypse, and identity politics is often one of the big hindrances to doing anything that's really needed to survive. It's more important that we abolish nuclear weapons than that we rip down and replace the right statues. But that's important too, and it all works together. The news this week that we might get an apology out of the Biden White House for having evicted the entire population of the island of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean to create a military base. I mean, this is important, not because those people are going to get their island back merely from an apology, but because they might get their island back in part as a result of an apology, and because people should learn about all the peoples in Alaska and in Hawaii and in Greenland and in Korea and in Central America who are booted out of their homes, not just in the ancient past, but in the 20th century and the 21st century for US military bases, and how outraged people would be if those were white people. I mean, this is, and while we have this history of people living on foreign US military bases in interracial communities and living without the racism that existed in the general United States, they also live with a form of intense apartheid, where the local people live outside the base and come on to the base to mow the grass and do the clean the kitchen and leave again and are paid crap for it and have no rights. And this is learned as well. I'm just reading this book called The Bodies Keep Coming, about a African-American doctor and how growing up and all the racism as he's trying to become a doctor. And he mentions the irony that in World War II, the world's greatest democracy fought the world's worst government, but with a segregated military. But it's not as ironic as you would think when you understand that the world's worst government learned segregation policies from the United States, learned eugenics beliefs and policies from the United States, learned half the horrible things it did from the behavior of the United States, which then ended the war and hired as many as the living top staff of that worst government ever into the US military and adopted their way of thinking and policies and continued right on with these sorts of horrors. So I think, history does matter, because, the past is never past, as Faulkner said. It's with us. We got to understand it to change it.
And then one final one, as we close, what do you think it's going to take, though, for the broad peace movement in the U.S., but even internationally, to show more urgent solidarity to the plight of to the plight of Native Americans? Because I think, in the U.S., when I look at groups like yourself, Code Pink, the Answer Coalition, Black Alliance for Peace, I find that there's a lot of strong, anti-imperialism activity, what the U.S. does overseas, and there is a lot of, there is a lot of solidarity and a lot of awareness of the plight of, Black people, Latino people, immigrants, legal or otherwise, as I often joke. but there doesn't seem to be that much level of mobilization or even just, a conscious feeling and awareness of the plight of Native Americans, Indigenous Hawaiians, and Indigenous Alaskans, in which the whole the whole U.S. imperialism, military-industrial complex, and all of the evils of the world, all of that really is rooted. Even their models are really rooted in the ongoing U.S. settler colonial project inflicted on the indigenous people, and same thing, in Australia and whatnot, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand.
One thing I would say in terms of organizing a multi-issue mass movement that includes peace, that isn't all progressive good things except peace, is watch the streets of Rome, Italy tomorrow and see what they can do, and see if it's as massive as I hope it will be. And if they can do it, why can't other Western countries do it? Another thing I would say, I mentioned the Monroe Doctrine. Even anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist peace activists think of the Monroe Doctrine as this horrible thing that was created 200 years ago, and then more or less sat on for 50 to 100 years, and then pulled out and used to abuse Latin America. And they don't understand that the Monroe Doctrine was used principally, to this day, was used principally in North America, was a justification for moving westward and killing and slaughtering and stealing and abusing and indoctrinating and taking the kids and sticking them in the schools to de-Indianify them. This is what the Monroe Doctrine was for. These people wanted not just to abuse and influence Latin America, they wanted to take over the entire hemisphere and make it the United States. And North America is where they succeeded, and Latin America is where they failed, right? And so I think as we try to bury the Monroe Doctrine with events on December the 2nd, when it hits 200 years, we have to understand we're burying something that's been used to this day more in North America than anywhere else, and has now been expanded to the world. So yes, it's about Latin America, but it's not only about Latin America, and it's not only about Latino people. It's about the indigenous people who were treated as if they didn't exist, or they weren't smart enough to know what was good for them, or they wanted to be in the United States because who wouldn't, and who were treated as property and the natural environment, not as human beings. So this is one thing we can do even within activist movements.
All righty. Well, we were joined on this. I wish I could talk to you for another hour, but David has to go. And so I think that's a perfect place to end. So we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with David Swanson. Let me remind people, he is the executive director of World Beyond War, the host of Talk World Radio on Pacifica Networks, and he has his and you can find on his YouTube channel and SoundCloud channel, and of course as part of rootsaction.org. And he's the author of several books, including the topic we were talking about, Leaving World War II Behind and When the World Outlawed War. David, thank you so much for joining me today. And my best of luck. Oh, yes. And people also should sign the petition demanding that Yurii Sheilazhenko, sorry if I butchered his name, demand that he be free. And David, I just hope that more and more people wake up to your message that we need to end war. We need to end this institution of mass murder, of violence is the only solution, and might makes right. So keep doing the great work you do. Give my best to Rachel and Greta, and all of you got, y'all continue to inspire me. So again, keep up the great work.
Great. Thanks very much, Yurii.